Hello, everyone, and welcome to Into the Terminal. Today, we're going to be taking a deeper look at shell scripting and cover a couple of additional topics like for loops and if statements. So let's go ahead and jump right on in. What we're looking at is a Red Hat Enterprise Linux system, and you'll recall from a previous episode, number 18, where we started with shell scripting, we created a small shell script. So what the script does is it prints out the time, runs a couple of commands to give some system stats, and then will show me the last login of a specific user. And you'll recall that in previous, we could call my script and give it a username, and it would print out this data. Oh, hold on. All right. So what we're going to do in the first couple of minutes of our episode here is we're going to add a if statement to check a condition before it actually executes something. So let me get my last piece of software installed, run it one more time to make sure that we look good. Excellent. All right. So what we did last time was we passed a parameter on the command line to be the argument of the user that we wanted to get the last login information for. And what I've done just recently is I made this little assignment here that says we'll create a variable called user query and we'll assign the thing in argument one to that. And previously, what we had done is we had moved to passing an argument from asking interactively. And my question is, why not both? Why not use the argument if it's there, or if it's not there, ask interactively? And so to make that decision, we're going to have to add in a statement to check to see if the user has entered an argument or we need to ask. So enter the if statement. So the syntax for if in the bash shell is if, and then we're going to test some criteria. So the open square bracket is a command called test that will resolve the interior of that expression to a true or a false value. And if it's true, we'll do the contents of the if loop. And if it's not true, we'll skip the contents of the if loop. So I'm going to use a command called -z to check to see if something is of 0 length. Okay, so if the user query variable has 0 length, there's no content in it, then we need to do this stuff. And Bash, unlike other interpreted languages, doesn't care about white spaces. However, I make sure that I put my white spaces in there and make it easier to read. And then to close out the if statement, we do a finish if, a fee. So if the variable doesn't have anything in it, then ask the user to input that content and then close. And then we'll go ahead and run our last. So let's try two things. One, does the script still work like it did before? All right, so we successfully get this last bit of data down here if we pass it on the command line. But if I just run my script with no argument, does it then ask me? It looks like it does. Let me see. Root. And it prints out the data. And maybe we need to put one more echo statement in there to separate out a little bit. So again, what we did was we checked whether the variable had something in it or not. If it did not have something in it, we asked the question. All right, but we could be more fancy in that too, and not just check whether the string had nothing in it. We could do something like look to see if that user is listed in the Etsy password file, or do a get ent on that user to see if we can get the entries, and that would hook us into additional authentication sources as well. All right, so the other thing that we could do is maybe instead of one user, we have a whole bunch of users passed on the command line. So how about we change our script one more time And we will say that a list of users that we're expecting to be passed on the command line are in all the command line arguments. So last time we talked about $1 is the first argument, $2 is the second argument, $3 is the third argument. Well, it turns out that $* is all the arguments, and we expect them to be space separated. So if there's nothing, we'll ask them for a single user. But now, instead of just querying one person with last, we're going to have to do a bunch of people. So for that, we're going to do an iterative loop structure called a for loop. For, and we give it a placeholder variable. I'm going to call mine I in $user query. All right, so let me double check what I'm doing here. So we'll read it. Yeah, okay. So that will work. Okay. And instead of user query, we want to do a last on $I. All right. So what are we looking at here? We've assigned user query to be all the arguments passed on the command line. And then we're going to go through a for loop. And for each one of those arguments, we're going to do a pass through our for loops. We're going to print an empty line, and then we're going to use the last command on that person that we're operating on. And then we're going to move to the next person, print an empty line, run the last command, and then move to the next person until all the command line arguments that have been passed will complete. Now, if I leave it just like this, things are going to work a little bit weird if we don't pass command line arguments. So let me just write this out, and then we'll try the other way and we'll fix it. All right. So if I do a my script on root, RHEL, and Fred. Oh, no, we got a problem there. Line 16, too many arguments. Ah, so my if statement failed because now I have that list of arguments and we're not the right format anymore. So let me temporarily comment this out because we'll fix it. But let me get my for loop going. There we go. So we did our pass for root. The RHEL user hasn't had any logins, so we just get an empty string. And then the Fred user doesn't exist, so we just get an empty string. So that worked correctly. And we can even add maybe an extra thing. Maybe a header that tells us which person we're operating on, so we can actually see that all three of those people are being used, right? So root, RHEL, and Fred were all parsed. All right, so that's a little bit on if structures and for loops. Let's transition to the second part of the show, and we can take a deeper dive. All right, so the second part of the show is where we take a deeper look into some of these topics. So now we're going to go back into the script, and we're going to make it so the if statement works correctly with the for loop by adding some additional criteria. Also, this is the part of the show where you guys can interact with me via chat. I'll watch that for questions, and I see Shantanu has already asked a couple. And then don't forget to like if you enjoy the content, share it with someone if you think it will help them. Or if you're a deferred viewer, you can interact with us by putting comments on the episode. We'll monitor and respond to those. All right, so Shantanu asks, for multi-Unix scripts, I use the command test, but square bracket for bash. why not start off with double square brackets? So there are several different ways that one can evaluate something that you're passing to the if command that will return a 0 or a 1, a true or false. Um, test is one of those commands. Square bracket is one of those commands. Double square bracket, I think, is a mathematic function. So that's why I don't use double squares, because I'm pretty sure that is to do like math resolution. And then Shuffsinu says that these are the usual bash versus other shell questions. True. So Red Hat Enterprise Linux ships with bash. It does ship with some other shells too, like Corn Shell and Enhanced C Shell or T Shell. But because bash is the default, that's what we're going to cover. Different shells will have slightly different syntaxes. So I try to do stuff that is cross shell compatible, like square bracket, but I can't try every shell on every platform. All right. So let's go back into our script here and we'll get this thing working a little bit better. So the problem we saw before the transition was when I did the if statement that I had in there, user query was more than one variable. And so dash Z saw that there was too many operands being passed to it because it was a space separated list. So let's see, what could we do to resolve that? Okay, so if this is, hold on, how about we enclose it in quotes? So that's all seen as a single string. Okay, and then instead of ending our if statement there, we're actually going to come down here. No, that may be enough. Let's see if that works. Okay, so the if statement was skipped over because it was non-zero. Let's try it without the, yep, without an argument. It asks, and then processes our for loop with exactly one person. All right, so what did I do there? One of the things that we haven't talked about a lot in the show is using quotes. So the complaint from dash Z was that there were multiple space separated arguments, and dash Z applies to one argument. So what I did was I enclosed my variable reference in quotes so that it's seen as a single string rather than multiple space separated strings. And because it's now a single string, dash Z can evaluate it correctly and see if it's a non-zero string or a zero length string. So that's what was happening there. Maybe in a future episode when we get even more into scripting, we talk about quotes because there's three types of quotes. There's single quotes, double quotes, and backslashes, and you use each of them in different places. But today was all about ifs and for loops. So let's talk about one other structure for ifs. Okay, so we have an else branch that we can stick in an if. So if the thing that we're testing is false, we'll fall into the else branch. So these are the things that should happen if the user query variable is empty. No user query things were passed on the. Um, sorry, let me try that again. So if user queries were passed on the command line, then we'd fall into this else branch. So how would we just print out a diagnostic message? Um, All right. Okay. So now what will happen is if we pass command line arguments, that causes this to be non-zero or false. And we fall down into this else category, and it will print out the word command line arguments detected, and then we'll hit our for loop down here. If command line arguments are not passed, we'll now have a message that says that we didn't detect any, and then we'll ask the user. And maybe put one more thing in there like that. Okay, so let's see if it works. If we pass it without any arguments, right? Command line arguments not detected, asking for a username, and then we iterate over that one list of one users and get the last information. If I call it with arguments, right, I get the else section of my if statement executed, and then it goes ahead and prints the iterative results for those three past user accounts. All right, how about one other thing? Maybe we should, over here, instead of saying checking for, maybe if it's empty, we should print a message. So this is another place where an if statement might be handy. Okay, so we're going to create a variable called last data. And last data will have that person's last information. And here we're going to say if, again, we're going to use the non-zero or zero. So if it's zero length, then I'm going to put in an error message and close our if. So now when we run the script for RHEL and Fred users, it should now have this error message that comes up instead of just blank lines. Oh, and something was wrong. Oh, we need an else. So I checked to see whether the last data existed, but then I didn't print it for the root user. So let's throw in an else here. Print out that data. Okay, so there's our last information for root, and then we got the error message for these two people. All right, so I'm using zero. There's a analogous, so we could do something like check for non-zero. So we could flip the syntax a little bit. So dash n says check for non-zero. If it's not zero, then print the last data, else echo the error message. So depending on whether you're checking for a positive or a negative determines which branch we're going to go down. Some other things that I do is I use -e a lot. That is a check to see if a file exists. So if we wanted to maybe open a log file as part of this script, we could do a check to see if the file exists before trying to open it for something. And I'm trying to think of where that's documented. I just opened the man page for Bash. Here we go. Here's a whole bunch of them where it's giving us string comparators or comparators that we can include in our if statements. So earlier we used -z. I just flipped that to a -n. Notice that you can use double equals to say if this value equals this value, or not equals, or less than or greater than. So there's a whole bunch of options that you can use for comparing things together. And this is all documented in the bash man page. All right. So maybe we want to do, maybe we'll just add in another read real quick and show you an example of that. All right, so I'm asking for a list of files, and then we're going to iterate over that list of files. And we do something like if the file exists, then do a long listing of it. But if the file doesn't exist, we should print out that doesn't exist. All right. So we have our if, then the stuff that we should do if the if is true, else the things that we should do if the if is false, and then the fee closes out that structure, enclosed within our for loop that starts with a do and ends with a done. All right. I didn't pass a command line argument of list of users, so I'll just put one in. And then it asks me for my list of files. So let's do etc password. Let's do etc shadow. And then one that I know is not going to be there, temp stuffy stuffs. Oh, and then I made the same mistake I did last time, which is not enclosing that string in quotes. No, I think that's right. Oh, let's try it. Okay, etc password. Etc shadow temp stuffy stuffs. Oh, and then it didn't disaggregate it because I included it as quotes. Yeah. I'll try one more time. Okay, so I got the quoting right. Finally, it works. So we get our listing for etc password because that file exists. We get our listing for etc shadow because that file exists. And then for temp stuffy stuffs, we fill into that else branch and we get our message that we designed to print out when we fall into the else branch. So we iterated through that entire list. We checked the conditions of something, and then we made a decision and executed something based off of that choice. All right, we can also check more than one thing. So you can do conditional execution. We can do something like if this exists and it's readable, then do something. So it turns out that this would cause a problem for us with Etsy Shadow because it does exist, but it's not readable. So we'd probably also have to change our error message here. Or is not readable. So that we can now account in the else statement for both things. Alternatively, we could add in a third thing. Else if, and then we don't need this extra or here. Okay, so if I've done my syntax correctly, so we check whether it's there and readable. If it is fails one of those two conditions, we then check to see if it's just readable. Which I think we should switch the other way. Because if it doesn't exist, then it may print an error about checking to see if it's readable. All right. So if it is not both things, it checks to see if it exists. If it doesn't exist, try that again. If it does exist, but it's not readable because it failed that first check, then it'll fall into the else. All right, let's try one more time. All right, Etsy password. Let's see, shadow, temp, stuffy stuffs. Oh, look at that. I've got my logic incorrect, right? Because it's printing errors for both of these, which is what we want, but it's printing the wrong error. So maybe I just have the logic a little bit incorrect. All right, so this is why. Okay. Okay, so let's read this logic one more time. If it both exists and is readable, print the long listing. Fails that, however, we'll check to see if it exists. So that means that it failed the first one, but it is not readable. So we'll print out that it's not readable. And if it neither exists nor is readable, we'll print out that it doesn't exist. Now let's see if that works the way we expect. All right, Etsy password, Etsy shadow, and temp stuffy stuffs. Okay, so now that you have the logic correct, it prints out the right content. All right. So I don't see any additional questions in the chat. We're at the limit of our time together today. So thank you for tuning in for um, RHEL Presents. I'm sorry, let's try that again. Into the Terminal. Don't forget to join me tonight for Dark Mode if you are interested in that. It airs at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And next week will be another Into the Terminal. And our topic for next week is not listed in our document. So next week we'll be covering another topic on Into the Terminal. Thanks, everybody.